Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of CCN. This is going to be our morning of tutorial talks. We'll have a tutorial on cognitive science, neuroscience, and AI. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Wei Ji Ma, who's going to present the tutorial on cognitive science. Wei Ji is an associate professor of neuroscience and psychology at NYU. He completed his PhD in physics at the University of Groningen. After postdocs in Caltech and the University of Rochester, he joined the faculty at Baylor College of Medicine, and in 2013 moved on to his current position at NYU. Wei Ji is well known for his developments and exploration of probabilistic approaches to perception and cognition. He's made many contributions in this area, one of my personal favorites being his paper on probabilistic population codes, which remains a topic of fascination and discussion in the field and a source of desperate confusion for many students. Wei Ji is also a very active public educator and is active in public outreach and is widely known for promoting the controversial notion that science is performed by actual human beings. If you haven't seen his Growing Up in Science series, you should. It will make you feel a lot better. And I also encourage you to check out his interview on the CCN blog. I think in just a few short paragraphs, he really nicely gives a sense of his insightful and candid approach to research, which I'm sure his talk will do as well. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for coming out so early. I'm not sure if it was the right decision, but I guess we all have to live with the consequences of our actions. I'll try to make it worth your while. Seriously, a tutorial, a 1-hour tutorial for this crowd, it's like having an intimate dinner with your 500 best friends. But I'm going to do my best, and the way that we're going to do this is focus on motivation and methods for behavioral modeling, not so much on results or a big picture overview. So if you're looking for those, you may leave now. I'll make you work. It's a tutorial. You have to do something yourself. Okay, I've been in this business of modeling of behavior for about 15 years, mostly Bayesian modeling, and the kinds of domains that I like to work in are pretty diverse. I'd like to be sort of apply the methodology to many different kinds of problems, from perception to like weird cognition stuff like choosing between cookies and chips or playing strategy games. I'll be presenting a poster on that tonight. Or monkeys determining which female to mate with based on the color of her face. That's a real project that's currently ongoing. So one takeaway lesson from this could be that behavioral modeling, even just Bayesian modeling, is very widely applicable. Another lesson, which is probably less generous but more encouraging, is that one can build a respectable career on a relatively limited skill set. That should give some of you hope. So why do we fit models? I'll start with a quote. The purpose of models is not to fit the data, but to sharpen the questions. That was said by a mathematician, Samuel Karlin. But the fact that he's famous shouldn't mean that we listen to him, and usually for every impressive quote, there's an equally impressive counter quote. I personally like this one. If a principled model with a few parameters fits a rich behavioral data set, I feel that I've really understood something about the world. And I think you really should listen to this guy. So why do we fit models? So a student in my lab, Bas here, he had the smart idea of just doing an anonymous survey of why, among the lab members about why they fit models. And here's some of the answers that he got. Maslow's hammer, which is pretty much, we have a hammer and everything is a nail. Because we can and we are good at it, to get in a high impact journal. Because Wei Ji says so, or my personal favorite, to drown a conceptually uninteresting question in math. So you might get the impression that my lab is full of sardonic, bitter people. So let me also give you the more serious answers. So to make inferences about latent causes of behavior that we cannot observe directly, to get to a simplified form of people's cognitive processes, and there's a lot of remarks like that. So the key words here seem to be simplified. You have to have a simple description, and you want to get at the heart of processes or mechanisms, right? So to me, that's really the core of modeling, that you don't look at behavior just in terms of summaries of the data, but you try to find somewhat principled underlying mechanisms that can connect to other experiments or even other fields. The agenda for today is model building, model fitting, and model comparison all in 1 hour. Part 1, model building. So we're going to start with what kind of model, then about a special kind of process model, which is Bayesian. We're going to talk about priors, likelihood, and then how to actually do Bayesian modeling. So what kind of model to choose? So there are 2 kinds of models, very roughly speaking. The first kind is a descriptive model. So that's a summary of the data in a function with usually a small number of parameters. So a typical example is a psychometric curve. Who has fitted psychometric curves before? All right, good. This is the interactive part. So you have 3 parameters per psychometric curve, for example, like the slope, the PSC, and the lapse rate, and you just describe the data using those 3 parameters. It's a more compact description than just giving every data point. Right? Similarly, if you fit a reaction time distribution, you might use X Gaussians. That's also just a function that summarizes the data. Prospect theory, I'm going to be a bit provocative here, is pretty much a model fitting exercise as well. Right? These kind of functions where subjective value relates to objective outcome, it's a weird function, and there's usually no principles behind it. It's just a fitting exercise. Now, fitting descriptive models is like doing the laundry. Like, it has to be done, but you don't actually learn a lot from it, or you're not particularly proud of it. So today we're going to, in addition, there's this danger that sometimes you can arbitrarily throw parameters at the problem to make the fit a little bit better, right? And then there's always this question, where do you stop, right? Do you add this 1 extra parameter to capture this small deviation between the data and the model? So what we're mostly going to focus on today is process models. So process models is a model that's based on a psychological hypothesis of how an observer or an agent makes a decision. And this relates to the interpretability that Nicole was talking about yesterday, because if you have a process model and it's hypothesis-based, then you at least have a hope to be able to interpret the parameters that you get out of the model, because they correspond to processes that you have postulated to start with. And then you can do further stuff like individual differences or model comparison. So an example of a process model is signal detection theory. It's a very simple process model, but it still separates 2 different processes. One is the corruption of the sensory signal by noise, that gives you those 2 distributions, and the other one is the observer's decision rule, which is where do you put your criterion. So as simple as it is, it dissociates those 2 processes, right? The decision rule from the noisy sensory encoding. So then you have a process model right there. Another example is the diffusion model. Who has used diffusion models here? Okay, that's a pretty popular model as well. Right? So there you also have a similar dissociation between like the accumulation of evidence and then how do you terminate the decision. These are some other examples. And typically, you can recognize those process models by those kinds of flow diagrams, right? The flow diagrams typically trace the path that the stimulus takes from encoding to decision to response, right? So this is from Soccer and Simoncelli. There's retinal speed, that's the stimulus, then there's the measurement, and then there's an estimate. And this is a working memory example. And then Jan Drukovic wins the prize for most colorful flowchart. But it's also a typical process model. Now, you may have noticed something special about the 3 process models on this slide. Anyone? These are Bayesian models, okay? Now, what is special about Bayesian models? So, if I think about it, there's actually not a very clear definition, but to me there are some characteristics. So the main characteristic is that the state of the world is unknown to the decision maker. So Bayesians often talk about uncertainty a lot, right? Uncertainty is that you have a belief distribution about the state of the world, and it has a certain width, and the width of that distribution is a measure of uncertainty. And the second thing is that a decision maker maximizes an objective function, okay? So if you do categorical perception, like many of us do, then the objective function is typically just accuracy. You want to be as correct as possible. However, it could be more involved. For example, if you do a continuous task, then it could be some measure of error that you're trying to minimize. Or if you introduce rewards or penalties, then you might be talking about point rewards. Now, there is a third aspect to Bayesian models, which is a bit of a stronger mechanistic claim, which is that the brain represents probability distributions. I put that as a separate point because this is more controversial, and there's less strong evidence for it. than for sort of the claims that are associated with the basis of the Bayesian models. So the first 2 points. Right, so, but I want you to know that there is that next step that you could take. So why would you fit Bayesian models? Okay, so there's a couple of reasons that you could think of. So one is sort of an evolutionary or almost philosophical one, which is that Bayesian models are focused on this notion of maximizing some kind of utility. And the idea is that evolution has had a lot of time to optimize certain processes, processes that are absolutely core to survival, typically perceptual processes, perceptual motor processes. So it is not a complete stretch of the imagination to think that some of those processes might actually be close to optimal, given the noise that's in the system. Now, this is hand-wavy, and it's really hard to prove, but it's a very cool idea, and it motivates many of us, even though we don't always openly talk about it. The empirical argument is that in many tasks, people are close to Bayesian. So that's hard to argue with. It's just generally a successful modeling framework. Then there's Bill Geisler's couch argument. This is Bill Geisler. This is a couch. But what I call his couch argument is one thing that I heard him say in a talk at one point, which is it's harder to come up with a good model sitting on your couch than to work out the Bayesian model. And that's a very it's a sentiment I can relate to, right? It fits in the theme of maximizing your career success while minimizing effort. And it's true, right? As we will see, the Bayesian models, they follow a very set recipe, and it's pretty straightforward to just execute that recipe for a given task instead of trying to be creative. Why would you try to be creative? Sorry, it's a tough crowd today. You were supposed to laugh at this point. That's better. So the last point is that, and this is actually the most interesting one, which is that the Bayesian model is just a starting point. It's a starting point for building better models. And in many cases, when human behavior or animal behavior deviates from optimality, deviates from the Bayesian ideal, you can still use the Bayesian ideal as a basis for modification, right? So you can build in suboptimalities at different stages of that processing stream. You can build in a suboptimal decision rule. You can build on other types of noise. So it gives you this anchor, this framework for generating new models. All right, so that uncertainty, where does it come from? So there's really two sources, very broadly speaking. One is noise, one is ambiguity. Noise, it can come from many sources. It could be like floaters in your eye, or atmospheric fluctuations, or fog in the air. Or it could be neural noise, photon shot noise, or Poisson noise in cortex. Ambiguity is also happening a lot, but that's more a property of the world. The fact that sensory observations are very often are consistent with many different possible interpretations, even in the absence of noise. So let's look at an example of that. So this is a video of a paper dragon that is not haunted or anything, but it does seem to follow you. Who has seen this before? Okay, if not, then this is your first homework assignment to go look this up. So who knows what the trick is here, or who hasn't seen this before? Any guesses? Yeah. Yeah. It's a hollow phase, right? So this is a variant of the hollow phase illusion. And the idea is that the hollow phase, if you are viewing it with a single eye or with a camera, which is essentially a single eye, it's an ambiguous visual stimulus, because the hollow, the concave shape, can also be, it would produce the exact same retinal image as a certain convex shape, a regular phase. So that means that our brain has a ambiguity to resolve there, right? And how would it do that? Well, the Bayesian view on this illusion would be that there's the likelihood, which is, I suppose that I have the hypothesis that the phase can be convex, which is a regular phase, or it can be concave, which is hollow. Then I'm going to ask myself, if it's a convex phase, how expected is this particular retinal image that I'm receiving right now? And that's called the likelihood. If it's a concave phase, what's the probability of that same retinal image under that hypothesis? And let's say for the moment that these likelihoods are approximately equal, which they might well be. But then the prior comes in. So the prior comes in is, the prior is how much do you expect either hypothesis to be true based on your previous experiences. Now, that itself is a statement that has to be broken down, because your experiences, is that your experience within the experiment, or within the past hour, or is it a lifetime of experience, or is it maybe even your evolutionary history? All of that is open to debate, but it is uncontroversial that in perception, observers bring to bear expectations based on previous experiences on current interpretation of sensory stimuli. So in this case, convex faces have been experienced much more than concave faces, so it would have a higher prior. So what you would get then is you would get a posterior probability by multiplying the likelihoods by the prior. So the likelihood is based on the current sensory evidence, which is the retinal image in this case. The prior is something that you already have before you started watching this video. So if you multiply those two, you get what's called the posterior distribution. I put a proportional sign there so that you know that you have to normalize this if you were to actually plug in numbers, so that's a proper probability distributions. But then the Bayesian hypothesis is that the brain would compute this posterior distribution and then perceive what is the most posterior probable hypothesis. Okay, so this is a process that would go on rapidly, unconsciously, largely, and the result of this would be that you perceive this face as convex, even though it's really concave. There's also the following part in the dragon. I'll let you think about that, how that works. It's actually a bit tricky to figure out why this illusion has that component that the face seems to be following you. Any questions so far? All right, everybody's still asleep? That's okay. Here's another example. So this is an anamorphic illusion by Cordwainer. Cordwainer was the inventor of the genre of anamorphic illusions. He's still alive. He's in his 50s, and he gives guest lectures in my illusions class for undergraduates every year. It's pretty amazing work. So this is a sidewalk drawing. Well, the sidewalk does stop at some point. So the sidewalk stops here, and this is a wall, but it looks like a three-dimensional scene. And this is what it really looks like from a different angle. So what you see here is that everything is widely distorted, but just from this angle, seen with a single eye, it looks like this rich three-dimensional scene. Okay, so we're going to do the first tutorial part here, which is I want you to pair up with your neighbor and discuss the following 3 questions. So in this illusion, where's the ambiguity? What role do priors play? And if you're set with those questions, then you can ask, what happens if you view with 2 eyes and why? I'm going to give you a few minutes. Don't be shy. Talk, speak out whatever you're thinking. And then I'm randomly going to pick a group to say what you're thinking. All right, go ahead. All right. Let's see where we are. Okay, I have a volunteer here who is going to give this a try.
Hi, so the ambiguity is that it could be 2D or 3D, I guess. Priors is that we're used to see 3D subway stops going underground, I guess. Yeah. And what happens if you view 2 eyes? Maybe that you see there's no depth, maybe something.
Yeah. Very good. Anybody else had the same thoughts? Good, yeah, so that was excellent. So the ambiguity is in the fact that lots of 3-dimensional objects have the same 2-dimensional projection, right? Our eyes are unfortunately just flat surfaces like the retinas. So that means that you can only have the 2-dimensional projection, and a real 3-dimensional scene would have created the exact same retinal image as the sidewalk drawing. So that's where the ambiguity is, that you have an infinity of many of possible interpretations consistent with your current sensory observations. Now, the priors are indeed favoring common objects, the ones that you've seen before, right? Like people and stairs and subway stations. So if there's ambiguity, then you might resolve that ambiguity by giving a higher prior probability to those possible hypotheses, And then what happens if you view with 2 eyes? Is that going to change the prior or the likelihood? So a small quiz here. Who thinks it's going to change the prior if you watch with 2 eyes? Who thinks it's going to change the likelihood? Very good. Like, it's going to change the likelihood because the likelihood is associated with the sensory observations. And in this case, if you're viewing with 2 eyes, you get 2 slightly different retinal images from each eye, which allows you to resolve the ambiguity even in the absence of a prior. Very good. So this is a cartoon of that same process. This is a 2-dimensional image. And this paper from Kirsten Yu, which is a good review paper, says that that same image at the bottom here can be caused by this whole variety of possible objects. However, among this variety of possible objects, there's only a few that would produce this two-dimensional image, but it's still infinitely many few. You never hear that anywhere else, but it's still infinitely many. And then you would want to have a prior that selects among those, right? So it has to be consistent with the image, but it also has to be a relatively common object, and some of these objects are more common than others. So this is how Bayesian inference plays a role in object perception. Very good. So there are also other priors. So we saw these two, but light usually comes from above. Slower speeds are more common than faster speeds. Cardinal orientations are more common than oblique orientations. So all of those have been shown to affect perception, and in many cases in ways that are consistent with Bayesian inference. So you may have heard the statement that Bayesian models are about priors. That's fake news. Don't believe it. It's wrong. Bayesian models instead are about decision-making, making the best possible decision. I already said that, but I'm saying it again so that you don't get confused. And it's about the brain representing probability distributions. So both of those statements can live completely happily without priors. And I'm going to demonstrate that to you, so that Bayesian inference is not all about priors. Who has heard of the law of common fate? Okay, not a lot of Gestalt psychologists here, I suppose. Law of common fate is pretty much that if these dots, they seem to be doing the same thing, then the brain binds them together and perceives them as a single object. In this case, this configuration of 3 that's moving up and in other configurations moving down. So this is a classic Gestalt law. But we can also interpret this in Bayesian terms using just likelihoods. So to do that, we start introducing what's called the generative model, which is the schematic of the hypotheses that could have given rise to these sensory observations. So for simplicity, I'm just going to consider a group of 5 dots that are moving either down or up, okay? And your sensory observation is that they're moving down, okay? But there's still 2 scenarios, at least 2 scenarios, actually many more, that could underlie this sensory observation. One is that there is a common motion direction, which is maybe those dots are invisibly tied together and they move together down. And that gives rise to the retinal image for each dot, R1 to R5. The other scenario, another scenario, is that each dot is independently moving, and it just happens to be that they all move down. Everybody okay with these 2 scenarios? Okay. So to make that a little bit more precise, I'm just going to attach numbers to it. So the probability of moving up or down under scenario 1 is 0.5, and under scenario 2, it's 0.5 independently for every dot. Everybody okay with that? And there are no other directions, and nothing else matters but motion direction. So if your sensory observation is that all 5 dots are moving down, then we're now going to calculate the likelihood of both of these scenarios. Okay? So the likelihood of scenario 1 is defined as the probability of this particular sensory observation, which is all dots moving down, under the hypothesis that the scenario is true. Right? So the scenario is that they move together, they're tied together, and they're moving down together. What is then the probability of the sensory observation? This is not a trick question. It's as simple as it sounds. What is it? Just say out loud the answer. 1, 2, 3, say. 0.5, okay? There's nothing difficult about that. I pretty much gave you that probability. Now scenario 2. So if each dot is independently moving up or down, what's the probability that of the sensory observation that they're all moving down? Anyone wants to give that a try? 1/32, okay? Who else was thinking 1/32? Great, okay, so this is pretty much the multiplication of the probabilities. 0.5 for every dot, so 0.5 to the power 5, which is 1/32, okay? So what does that mean? How many times larger is the likelihood of scenario 1 over scenario 2? 16, right? 1/32 is 16 times smaller than 0.5. So that means that if you are viewing these dots as all moving down, then the likelihood of the scenario of scenario 1 is 16 times larger than the likelihood of scenario 2. And there's no priors that come in here. Let's say the priors are just equal for those two scenarios, then the posterior probability of scenario 1 is also going to be 16 times larger than of scenario 2. Everybody on board? So that means with likelihoods like these, who needs priors, right? This phenomenon is purely explained by likelihoods. Priors might still play a role, but it's a much more murky explanation, right? Likelihoods are doing the job here. You have a question, good.
If you have a world in which the common movement is much more likely in long term than independent movement, you would install priors?
Yes. Yeah, so I'm not saying that priors are absolutely unimportant here, but most of the perception is determined by likelihoods. And in fact, it's really difficult to figure out what the prior of these two scenarios are, because you would have to look at the frequencies of those in the natural world, and that's hard. All right. So Bayesian models are, again, about the best possible decision, whether that involves priors or not. Any more questions about this point? Good. All right, so if you want to review that argument, there's this very good book by McKay, where you have to just look in sections 28.1 and 2. This is pretty much the same argument that I'm making here. All right, next point, how to actually do Bayesian modeling. So I gave you a motivation, but how to actually do the work. So the good news is that there is a general recipe that you just need to follow. I already said that. There's no bad news. This is the recipe. It's 4 steps, step 1 to step 4. This is from a book that I'm co-writing with Conrad Kurding, which will be published by Oxford in 2018, really. I've been procrastinating. Sorry, Conrad. Conrad isn't here. I'll tell him. But this recipe, which you can get from the slides that you already downloaded, you can just follow pretty much for every task, and you're set. So just let's do a little experiment here. So an auditory localization task. I'm going to ask you in a second to close your eyes. I'll be moving around on this stage to a certain location without a microphone, and I'm going to say point. And the moment that I say point, you just point where you think I am, and you open your eyes and you keep your hand and you should look at everybody else's hand. Everybody okay with that? Okay, close your eyes. I'm going to put the mic down now. And I'm going to wait for 10 seconds or so. Point. Okay, open your eyes. All right. So now we see a response distribution here, right? Like some people are and people are completely off. They aren't. That's good. Good. So. That was an example of a very simple psychophysics experiment. Each person was one trial, so overall you get some kind of distribution. So let's see how a Bayesian model would deal with this. So this is now going to follow the step process, and it's going to introduce a little bit of math here to make it a bit more concrete. Okay, so the generative model here is that you have true position here, right? So one-dimensional position, we call that S for stimulus, okay? You have a prior, there's a distribution over stimuli, right? There's possible locations where I could be, not all of which are a priori equally probable. But then there's also going to be a noisy measurement, right? There's going to be a measurement of position that you have in your head. And of course, that noisy measurement is just an abstraction of the noisy activity in your cortex, okay? So we're going to just simplify that to a scalar. So X is a measurement that you can literally think of as I'm measuring the size of an object, and that's in centimeters, and then the measurement is, and the true stimulus is also in centimeters, right? So the X and S have the same unit, right? In this case, it would be horizontal position. Right, so now we're going to make this a little bit more formal. So we're going to assume that there is a prior, which is a Gaussian. And that prior might have to do with the fact that you know how much time it took me until I said point. And you might have made an assumption about the speed that I had, and that I would probably not be on the other side of the room. Okay, so you can think of that as a prior, and it could be a Gaussian prior. In this example, I'm just putting in some numbers, so I just centered it as at 0, but in general it could be centered anywhere. It doesn't even have to be Gaussian. And then there's a stimulus distribution width, which is the sigma s, right? That's just how uncertain you are about my position without even hearing me say point. And then you have the measurement. So the measurement arises from the stimulus. So that's why in order to model that, we have to use this notation, which is probability of x given s. That's called a conditional probability distribution. So that means that if you know the true stimulus, let's say I'm literally standing here, then your measurement of my position will still be noisy and not be exactly here. It might follow another Gaussian distribution that is now centered at S, which is where I'm standing, but it's going to have some width around that. So this sigma is your measurement noise. So that's the noise that you have internally that determines the quality of your sensory representation. This sigma is the one that you would also be affected by your attention level, right? So if you're still very asleep, like some people here, then maybe your sigma would be a little bit higher. I don't know if that actually works, if there is an effect of fatigue on spatial localization. I just made a very strong claim there. Probably there isn't. Okay, so the measurement X follows some kind of distribution. I just drew a few samples here. Everybody okay with this concept? Measurement is just stimulus plus noise. Okay, so in this extremely simple model, that's what the brain has to deal with. So we're now going to move to step 2. We now defined how the measurement comes about. That's called the generative model. And now we're going to work our way backwards, which is the inference. Your brain is doing the inference. You have the noisy measurement, and it's your brain's job to figure out where I was based on that noisy measurement. So how do you do that? Well, prior and likelihood. The prior we already saw. It was this distribution. But this is now a belief distribution that you are maintaining. This could be a wrong belief distribution. Maybe this prior was inaccurate. In this case, I chose it to be the same as it was in the real world, but it doesn't have to be. Now, the likelihood here is the tricky one, which is the probability of this particular observed measurement, the one that you just had in your head, under a hypothesis about S. The hypothesis is similar to previously we had convex and concave for the hollow face. Right? But in this case, the hypothesis is a continuous variable. It's any possible position that I'm walking on now, right? That's a possible hypothesis. So the likelihood is going to be the probability of the measurement that you have in your head under that under each possible hypothesis. As you vary the hypothesis, that maps out a curve, and that's the likelihood function. Okay, so the likelihood function is derived from the noise distribution. In fact, mathematically, it has the same shape, has the same form, but the interpretation is entirely different. The likelihood function is something that lives inside your head. It has to do with your uncertainty about the state of the world. Okay, this took me about 5 years to understand, so don't worry if you don't get it in 5 minutes, but I'd be happy to elaborate. So once you have the prior and likelihood, you can get the posterior. You multiply them, right? You just multiply just like we saw before, and you get this purple curve. So what do you see in the purple curve? Right? So in the purple curve, you see a couple of things. What are your observations here? So just give one observation. Would you like to start?
Sure, the observation is that the posterior is very similar to the likelihood.
And why do you think that might be?
Because the likelihood is a sharp, low uncertainty.
Very good. So that is one very important characteristic of Bayesian inferences in general, right? That if you have a prior and a likelihood, one is sharper than the other. It means it's more informative. Then the posterior is going to be closer to the thing that's more informative, whether that's the prior or the likelihood. Very good. And the other thing is that it's going to be sharper than both of them. So this is actually why it's useful for the brain to do inference in this Bayesian inference in this task. But by combining the prior and the likelihood, you get a higher certainty than what you would have had with either alone. Does it make sense? This purple distribution is narrower than the blue or the red. All right, here's a discussion point for you. If I have a Bayesian model, I fix the stimulus. So as an experimenter, you can present the same stimulus over and over again. Let's say the subject is also kept fixed, so we have the same parameters. Is there a deterministic mapping from the stimulus to the posterior? So for the same stimulus, will the observer always have the same posterior? So discuss this with your neighbor for a couple of minutes. All right. So now that you got a chance to think about it, I just want to do the poll here. Huh? So who thinks deterministically predicted? Raise your hand. Who thinks not deterministically predicted? Okay, it's not deterministically predicted. Why not? Yeah.
The X observation is a random.
Perfect. Right. So you see that the posterior depends on the observed measurement X obs. Now that itself is a random variable. Even if you fix the stimulus, your measurement is going to vary. So here I'm drawing 3 examples of measurements, 3 observed measurements, x-ops, here the blue point there, the blue point there, and the blue point there. And for each measurement, you're going to have a different likelihood function and therefore a different posterior. So that means that even if you fix the stimulus, because of your noise in your observed measurements, the posterior is going to jump around from child to child. Okay? Your belief distribution is going to be centered at a different point every time. Everybody okay with this? Okay. It's a very common mistake to think that the posterior is just completely determined by the stimulus. Step 3 is response probability. So eventually you want to fit your data. So how do you do that? Well, so far we've looked at a rule from measurement to an estimate. Oh, sorry, I didn't talk about the estimate, but the estimate is the peak of the posterior, right? What is the stimulus at which the posterior peaks? That's S hat. Okay, yeah, that's your estimate of the stimulus. It's not equal to the measurement. It's also going to be affected by the prior, right? So now that we have that, we want to make a prediction for the experiment. The problem is, of course, that X is not known because X is in the observer's head on a single child. So how do we deal with that? Well, we can regard it as a random variable. We already know what distribution it follows according to the model. That was step 1. So what you can do then is you can calculate the distribution of S hat that is inherited by the variability in the measurement. Does that make sense? X is a random variable. It has a certain distribution, P of X given S. Then S hat is a function of X, so it's also going to follow a certain distribution, and that's going to be P of S hat given S. Yeah? So in these Bayesian models, of perception at least, you get most of your variability out of sensory noise, right? The noise that you put into the measurement works its way through to your decision, and the stochasticity you see in subject's behavior is presumably captured by that kind of variability. And this is something that you can directly compare to data. This is the distribution of estimates given S. So if I were recording all your pointing directions a moment ago, I would have a distribution like that, P of S hat given S. So I can compare my prediction. Questions? Right. So these 4 steps are pretty much the same recipe for every task. Of course, the details can get messier depending on what your task is. A quick remark on the last point about representing probability distributions. So that is a little bit more tricky because so far we've only made a prediction for the response distribution. And the way that we arrived at this was through a Bayesian formalism. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the components of that Bayesian formalism, such as likelihood and posterior, are represented in the brain. Because what if the brain just learns that rule, the mapping from measurement to response? And it would be then would be indistinguishable from the formalism that has all those inner parts working to produce the rule. Does it make sense? So there's always this question of whether we can find evidence that the components that go into the Bayesian mechanism are actually represented in the brain. And the tests that you can do to do that are of a nature of Bayesian transfer. So this is a concept introduced by Maloney and Mamassian. That's probably one of the most useful papers to read in this field. And the idea is pretty much that if you have 2 tasks and you would have something that's close to Bayesian or optimal in both of those tasks, what you would do is you could you could switch out one of the components inside. For example, in this case is the gain function, or that's the utility function if you want. You can swap that out, so you can combine the G2 from the second task with the likelihood and the prior from the first task. And then you can see if people are instantly optimal without having to relearn. A similar idea is that you swap out the likelihood from on a child-to-child basis, that you vary reliability on a child-to-child basis without feedback. So that's a pretty strong test whether the likelihood is really represented in the brain. And Mehrdad Yassiri and I wrote a review paper along the same lines. Okay, part 2, model fitting. So now you have a model, which is actually step 4 of the recipe. We talked about step 1, 2, 3 of the recipe. Step 4 is model fitting. So now you have a model, you want to fit it to data. So this is getting very methodological. I thought it to be extremely concrete here because that's probably the most useful. So I'm going to ask, what are you actually going to minimize or maximize when you're fitting a model? What algorithm do you use? And then how do you validate it? Okay? So what do we minimize or maximize when fitting a model? What's the first thing that comes to mind? What do you want to minimize or maximize when you fit a model? Just shout it out. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I hear likelihood and I hear error. Okay, so squared error is a very good try. However, it turns out that that's only principled if your model is linear. Otherwise, it's arbitrary and it's suboptimal. So you don't want to do minimizing square error unless you have a linear model, like an ordinary linear regression. Okay. Indeed, the more general solution is to maximize your likelihood. So this word, likelihood, we have encountered before, but this is a different use of the word. Okay, so this is now from the point of view of an experimenter trying to infer the parameters of a participant. Previously, the likelihoods were the participant trying to infer the state of the world. Okay, so there's 2 layers of likelihood here. Okay, that's very typical for Bayesian models. So in this case, the likelihood is of the parameters. So, for example, the noise parameter in a particular participant will have individual differences. So you want to calculate the likelihood of a parameter combination, which is the probability of the observed data given the parameter combination. Now, previously we had from the model, step 3, the probability of the response given the stimulus and the parameter combination. So what you can do is you can just expand this as a product of all the trials, assuming that the trials are independent, and you can plug in the response stimulus for the data. So what this means is that you're finding the parameters under which the particular response stimulus-response relationships is the most expected. Okay, that's the likelihood, maximum likelihood estimation. Does that make sense? Okay, so it took me like many years before I realized that minimizing the squared error is a special case of maximizing the likelihood. It's a special case if you have a linear model with Gaussian noise. But the likelihood is really the general thing that you want to do. Okay, so what does it look like? So let's say we are fitting this sigma, which is this noise parameter. Analogous to previously your observer having a hypothesis about the state of the world, you're now going to be the experimenter having a hypothesis about the state of your subject, about your participant, which is sigma. So this is, each value here is a hypothesis about what the noise level of your subject is. For every value on this axis, you can calculate the likelihood using the equation of the previous page. And typically, you take the logarithm, otherwise you get values that are very close to 0. It's hard to work with. So you take the logarithm, and it has a shape that might look like this. Almost always, that's going to have a peak. And that's going to be the maximum likelihood estimate of your parameter. Okay? That is the value of the parameter under which the subject responses are most probable. Here I've done this for a single parameter, but the idea is the same for multiple parameters. If you have multiple parameters, you can get what's called parameter trade-offs. So here we have 2 parameters, a guessing rate and the precision. Okay. What Shan did here is she varied both of those parameters, and the color code is now the log likelihood. What you can see here is that there's still a maximum. It's about here. But it is a very diffuse maximum, which means that there is somewhat of a trade-off between these 2 parameters. If you have, like you can trade off precision against guessing rate. And if I think about this, this is probably 1 over precision, because otherwise it doesn't really make sense. That the fit is very similar if you have a higher guessing rate or if you have a lower precision. Right? And then you have a trade-off between those 2 parameters that you get approximately the same goodness of fit. Right? So that is a very common phenomenon. Here's another example that you have these maxima that are very diffuse, and it's hard to identify the exact value of the parameter. So what does that mean in practice? It means that you have to be careful to use the right algorithm that can deal with this issue. And the second, whatever parameter estimate you get, you have to take with a grain of salt, because there are many other parameter estimates that could have produced almost the same goodness of fit. Okay? So what fitting algorithms to use? So there are questions in this world that require complex and nuanced answers. This is not one of them. So the answer is use BADS. So what's BADS? It stands for Bayesian Adaptive Direct Search. This is an algorithm that was developed by my postdoc Luigi at Serbi, who compared maybe 20 other common algorithms that are used in the field, and BATS did the best overall. So I would strongly recommend it. I wouldn't say only use that, but it's probably the best on the market right now. And this is the paper that goes with it. So I'm going to just show you some examples. So fminsearch, who knows fminsearch in MATLAB? Great. It's a good workhorse. And let's see how it deals with minimizing a negative log likelihood. So what was previously a hill is now a valley. So you can think of this as a negative log likelihood or something like that. But the actual problem is what's called the Rosenbrock banana function. So it's shaped like a banana, and people in numerical mathematics have used this as a test case for optimization algorithms because it has this very broad valley, and then the true minimum is at this red point. So it's very easy to get to the valley, but it's very difficult for an algorithm to find that exact point. So let's see how fminsearch does. So these are different iterations. It finds the valley very rapidly, and then it sort of walks around in the valley, chilling. This is very Zen-like. This is closest to meditation that you get in this field. And then eventually it reaches the minimum. Okay. So now we're going to look at how BATS does. Gets there much faster. You also see that it's a very different kind of algorithm. So fminsearch is based on the local gradient. It just goes down the slope into the valley, right? Whereas this algorithm starts with a whole bunch of points that are scattered all across. So this is a global optimizer, and then in a smart way it tries to zoom in. It managed to zoom in on the region of interest. Yeah. Yeah. So this is for behavioral models. This is not for fitting neural networks. No. Sorry. That's a different tutorial. So we're talking about up to maybe 20 parameters here. 20 parameters is still manageable, but you are not talking about hundreds of parameters here. Right. The code is all on Luigi's GitHub, so you can just download it. It's plug and play. You use it the same way as fminsearch. So if you know fminsearch, there's no learning curve. You can just plug it in. And Luigi would be really happy to hear about how this goes, if it works for you. So the model fitting best practices are, if you can, maximize the likelihood. So do not minimize the squared error, and do not fit summary statistics. This is also a common issue. Some people, they don't fit the raw data, they fit summary statistics. That's misleading because you are missing something that you are not summarizing. So some dimension that's orthogonal to your summary statistics. Use more than one algorithm. As much as I love BATS, it's always good to double check your results with multiple algorithms. So the most pedestrian, but it shouldn't be dismissed, is just a grid search, right? If you have a low number of parameters, you just do a coarse grid, you loop over all possible combinations, you go to bed, and when you wake up, you have some idea where the maximum is, right? fmincon is the slightly better version of fminsearch. Worked really well for problems with a clear maximum or clear minimum, and then BATS. Also, regardless of what algorithm you use, except if it's grid search, use multi-start. Multi-start means that you initialize it with a random starting point and you do it multiple times. Because many of these algorithms, they are sensitive to where you start. For example, by getting stuck in a local minimum. And you don't want to do that because you want to find a global minimum, okay, or the global maximum. Right? Any questions about this? Good. So now how do you figure out whether it works? You can do something that's called parameter recovery, and that pretty much means that you run the model forward with parameters values that you know, and you see if your model fitting algorithm spits out those same parameters or something very close to it. So this came from Jen Lee, who's in the audience here, just a couple of days ago. So she has 4 parameters. This is a diffusion model. And this is the parameter that she puts in, and this is the parameter that she gets out. 3 of these 4 parameters are pretty well recovered, and the lapse parameter is not very well recovered. That's a common issue, and it just means that you have to be really careful with interpreting the estimates that you get out of this. Okay? But mostly, this parameter recovery is a way to debug your code. Right? It's a very simple way to debug your code, to see if you get sensible estimates out. Last part, and that's going to be much briefer, is a model comparison. Is it going to be briefer? I'm not sure, actually. Choosing a model comparison metric. So how do you compare models? Usually you have more than one model. first try is just to look at the data, right? It's visually similar. So you can do that. You say, okay, this model looks like a much better fit to the data at the circles than all the other models, okay? That's very satisfying, but it's not very quantitative. So the other try is a common one, which is R squared. Just don't do it, unless you have only linear models, which almost never happens. Okay, R squared is just like minimizing squared error. It's a valid metric for linear models, very usually not valid outside of that. So likelihood-based metrics are the state of the art in the field. Now there are still many of them, and in the same poll that Bas did, these are the different metrics that people in the lab are using or favoring: AIC, ACC, BIC, K-fold, cross-validation, leave it out, etc. So even within the same lab, there's a diversity of methods that we favor, let alone in the field. And now there's a rough division between metrics that are based on the maximum likelihood. So we already did maximum likelihood estimation, but that was to find the value of the best fitting parameter. What you can also do is like, how high is the likelihood at that point? So what is the value of the maximum likelihood? And it's really useful because you already have that you can use that for model comparison. And that's why AIC and BIC are so common, because they just use based on that value that you have anyhow from your optimization. Now, there are more sophisticated methods that are based on the full likelihood function. Those are called Bayes factors or Watanabe-Akaike information criterion, and cross-validation can be in either of these categories. But there is also a very interesting other division, which is that there are metrics that are based on an attempt to explain the current data as good as possible without overfitting, and there are metrics that are based on prediction. And even though AIC and BIC seem very similar, they differ only by one letter, they are actually in different categories. So BIC is based on explanation, AIC is based on prediction. So the philosophy is very different. And cross-validation would mostly be in the prediction category. So if you're a statistician, you can spend your entire lifetime or multiple lifetimes debating the pros and cons of these different metrics, and statisticians are doing that. I want to take a more practical approach here, because we're not statisticians, which is that no metric is perfect. Every metric you can find some regime where it's biased. So don't blindly trust your metric. AIC, very common, tends to under-penalize free parameters. BIC tends to over-penalize. Be aware of that. And here's the most important punchline here. Do not trust conclusions that are metric dependent. Right? So if you try multiple metrics, then you get contradictory results. Just be very, very careful in formulating your conclusions. What some people do is they pick their favorite metric, but favorite means that gives them the result that they want. Bad idea, don't do it. Okay, so report multiple metrics that you can and just be upfront about possible contradictions. This is the kind of table that we have in our papers, where we have AIC, BIC, and then log marginal likelihood, and we just are upfront about what the differences are between the metrics. Okay, so how do you validate model comparisons? Any ideas? Based on the parameter part, is there any hint that you could apply here? Well, it's model recovery, right? We did parameter recovery. You can do model recovery. You can simulate data from a given model, run your model comparison algorithm, and then see if it returns that correct model. Right, so what you could do, for example, if you generate the data from one of these three models, you fit the same three models, and you see if the fit of the correct model, the one that you put in, is actually the best. And besides looking at the plots, you can also look at your model comparison metric, and you see whether the correct model wins in every case. And this is a kind of table that you could get out of this. This is a case where you have many models. And you have many models here. These are the generated models. These are the fitted models. And what you hope to see is that the best model for every generated model is on the diagonal. Does it make sense? This is not an be it end all, but this is a good first way to debug your code and your algorithms. How am I doing on time? Is anybody keeping track of time? I have 3 minutes. Okay, thank you. So how to avoid handpicking models? So this is something that's called factorial model comparison. Models often have very many moving parts, so components that can either be in or out. So what you could do, and we worried about this for a long time, is you can do this something that's similar to factorial design of experiments, which is that you can mix and match those moving parts. Each part can be in or out. So these papers you can look up. I'm not going to go into details. There's actually a talk that Minyu is giving that uses this method. But you end up with like this grid of models, essentially, right? This one dimension, other dimension, and all combinations. And you end up with a shitload of models. And the challenge here is how to summarize the results. So in recent work, we've thought about ways to summarize the results of a factorial model comparison. The message here is not that this is always going to give you a clear answer. In fact, it often doesn't. The message is that by not doing it, you might be making a mistake because you might be handpicking the parts in this model, the points in this model space that match to your preconceived notions. Okay, so I would encourage it, even though the results might be discouraging. So the next challenge is that a best model is not necessarily a good model. Right? So far we've compared models, but just like not the best presidential candidate is not always a good presidential candidate, you also want to see if the best model is actually a good model. So that's called absolute goodness of fit. And the first way is just called visual inspection. You just look at it, like, oh, this model was the best, and it actually sort of goes through the data. And that's a sensible, common sense things to do. We do it all the time and then write about it in papers. It looks like a good model. There's nothing wrong with that. But you can also do a little bit more. You can do what's called the deviance, or you calculate the deviance or the negative entropy. The basic idea there is that there is the unexplainable variation in data, right? If you give the same stimulus to the subject, they're not going to always make the same response. So that's irreducible variation. There's no model that can explain that kind of stochasticity. You can only do that in a probabilistic sense, right? So that sets an upper limit on the goodness of fit of any model. So then you can compare the goodness of fit of your best model to that upper limit. And that's a really elegant way of computing the absolute goodness of fit, like how much room is there between your best fitting model and the theoretical best. And you can look at these two papers if you're interested in knowing more about that. And then finally, this is a very common issue, also one we struggled with for a long time. What if different subjects follow different models? So you have the heterogeneity in the population. And fortunately, the answer has been worked out for this as well. This is done by the group of Carl Friston, with Klaas Stefan being the main driver of this work. Which is essentially going to consider all possible partitions of your population. Let's say that these subjects follow model A and those subjects follow model B, and you do that with all possible combinations. It's crazy if you think about it, but you can make this work. And he has made his work in two papers. This more recent paper is the improvement. And it returns the probability that each model is the most common model in the population. It also returns the posterior probability for each model. So it's really an elegant addition to the model comparison that you are already doing. And these days we report that in almost every paper that we write. And they made their MATLAB code available online, so you can just plug and play. And this is a poster where this is used by one of my students. All right, that brings us to the end. So we've done model building, we've done model fitting, model comparison. I would just say good job, everyone. Thank you.